is my pleasure as the recently co-opted acting chair of the IAI to be asked this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Steve Davis. Steve is our vice chair and has been an active member of the Institute for many years. Originally an environmental archaeologist with a special interest in insects and pollen, Steve obtained his PhD at Liverpool John Moores University. Steve came to Ireland and UCD in 2006, where he is now a lecturer and assistant professor. Steve is also a specialist in remote sensing and has been leading research projects that have included the integration of LiDAR, geophysical survey, and excavation in the World Heritage Site of Brú-na-Bóinne and, of course, on the hillfort, both of which are in County Meath. He is also co-director of the Cotroni Archaeological Survey in Attica, Greece. In addition to his role as vice chair of our institute, Steve is also vice chair of the Aerial Archaeology Research Group, a board member of the Discovery Programme, and sits on various other committees, including the National Climate Change Planning Committee and the Dublin City Heritage Plan Forum. The interest in Steve's talk on the Hill of Ward this evening is evident from the number of you that have signed up in the middle of what is a fairly packed National Heritage Week. With no further ado, I'm delighted to give you Dr. Steve Davis, and of course I realise now that Cathy Moore is also joining him. I haven't prepared an introduction for Cathy, but she's probably familiar to many of you as a wonderful excavation director and, of course, one of Ireland's leading wood specialists. Okay, so I'll pass over to you now, Steve.
Firstly, thanks very much for coming. And when we discussed as a board the possibility of doing Heritage Week talks, I thought, well, I could do the Boyne again, but as we're kind of entering the final throes of actually writing this up for publication, I thought it would be a good time to revisit the Hill of Ward stuff and just kind of present a more complete overview than I probably have before. Because there's been bits and pieces that we haven't really talked about going through it, and there's more stuff coming in all the time. So what I'm going to really talk about today is the excavations and finds, and try and piece some of it together, the dating such as it is, and try and understand a little bit of what's actually going on at the site over quite a long period of time. Okay, so I'm going to talk. The other thing that I'm probably not going to go into in any great detail, and I've got presentations that specifically just go into that, is the folklore, the myth, the medieval literature, I suppose, about Tlachtga, and I still can't say that name properly after all these years. So I'll talk a little bit about that, a little bit about the site, but in general, a lot of what I'll talk about is the backgrounds of the research, the remote sensing, the geophysics, the excavation, and then try and put some of that together. As a warning, I've put a little note to myself there. I am going to show a couple of images of the human remains that we found, in particular the infant burial that we found. So if anyone is concerned about that, then I will give you a little bit of what I'll give you a warning before they appear. Okay. So the site that I came to, really, and that we came to when I first started this project, and it was a slightly bizarre kind of genesis. Effectively, I had just finished working with the LiDAR data from Brú, and I was looking to try and expand the LiDAR work to somewhere else. I was only just really getting the hang of working with LiDAR at the time. So I thought, well, let's see where else there is. And one afternoon, whilst looking around on Google Earth, I happened to stumble across this, Tlachtga, which is this incredible site. It's sitting on top of the Hill of Ward. It's this enormous quadri-valley ring fort. We call it a ring fort for want of a better description. And it's one of really very few quadri-valley sites that we can think about in Ireland. So Conor Newman years ago really talked about there being, I think, 3, 4. There may be a couple more than that. So Paddy Gleeson, I know, has described a couple more since then. But the obvious comparator that we know, well, 2 comparators that we know about, one is the Rath of the Sinnott and the other one is Rathra down at Rathcrohan. There's another one in Donegal which has 5 banks and ditches, but it's mostly under forestry and it's very hard to get a decent view of. But it's a really spectacular site, very messed around with. But 4 banks and ditches, large central platform. Can you see my mouse cursor when I do this? I'm never sure if you can or not.
Yep.
You can.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So large central platform. This kind of sinuous ridge and sort of cut in the middle, you'll see it in a better view in a moment. But there's a central platform that's about 45 meters in diameter. And then there's this cut right through the middle of it. There's various other holes in it. It's missing almost entirely to the southeast, which is this section over here. But even in this condition, it's a very spectacular monument. It's 150 meters across, which is, you know, staggeringly large for a ring fort, and really had been very little researched. So it had been written about. Various people over the years had written little bits about it, including particularly R.A.S. McAllister had written about it. Westrop had written a little bit about it. So all of these kind of 20th century, late 19th century people had touched upon it. And I know Barry Raftery had also been interested in it and talked a little with Richard Warner about it. But there was always this question as to whether we were looking at a particularly large ring fort, a late Iron Age monument, or something else entirely. So I started really on this with the remote sensing stuff, with the geophysics, LiDAR and then geophysics. So I'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. This is the 2014 season of excavation that you can see here, and you'll hear more about all of this as I go through. So one of the other really interesting things about Tlachtga in particular is that it has this, it's a site that's mentioned in Dinshenicus, so the place name law, and also it has this Geoffrey Keating connection, and Geoffrey Keating will come on to in a moment there. But I'm not going to go through it in massive detail, but Dinshenicus associates the place with Tlachtga as a person, as is the way in a lot of Dinshenicus stuff. It tries to put stories behind, if you like, landscape manifestations of monuments. But in this case, we have Tlachtga as a person, as a female magician or druidess who travels east to learn witchcraft or magic, let's say, from Simon Magus. Now Simon Magus is a very interesting character. We don't really think very much about him in a modern sense, but in the medieval world, he was seen as a really big bad guy in the medieval church, so regarded as the father of all heresies. So this is a site that is particularly associated with this guy who is described in places as being the Antichrist. It's an interestingly pagan place, let's say. So Westrop in 1919 talked about it bearing the name of an ill-reputed sorceress in the church had a hatred not found against other of the Celtic gods and heroines. So there is this very interesting connection with let's say, the opposite of Christianity, with paganism. We can then move on to Geoffrey Keating, and Geoffrey Keating talked about 2 different things, I suppose. On the one hand, he talked about Tlachtga, so this potentially non-existent 1st century AD Irish High King, who was regarded as founding the Kingdom of Meath from parts of the 4 provinces. And in particular, he created these 4 major fort sites, or he's described as having done that, of which Tlachtga is one. So we have Uisneach from Tara from Leinster, Telton from Ulster, and Tlachtga from Munster. And he's described in one of the texts as being Turl of Tlachtga in Metricals in Dinshenicus. Now, we can't take this too literally. Adele Brannock has written particularly about the lack of geographical sense of these, if you like, 4 corners of Meath, the Kingdom of Meath. But it's an interesting connection anyway. And if nothing else, it shows that this is a site that was really considered to be a major ritual centre at that point, a major power centre, let's say. The other interesting thing that Keating raises is this the birthplace of Halloween idea. Now, again, we can't necessarily take any of this too literally, but Keating, who we may or may not trust, most people don't necessarily trust Geoffrey Keating, but talks about the fire of Tlachtga, and talks about there being a fire which was lit at Samhain, and all other fires in Ireland were extinguished. And priests and at Tlachtga consume sacrifices and charge a tax, essentially, and then all fires in Ireland will be relit from the fire at Tlachtga. Now, again, this is all kind of we had no evidence of this. We probably still have no evidence of this, but it's an interesting story, and again, it fits. It's an interesting kind of tale behind the importance of the site, I suppose. Let's talk a little bit about some of the remote sensing and geophysics. Firstly, this is a nice LiDAR image of the site, and it gives you a lot more of a sense of what's actually going on at the site. It's very hard to interpret from the ground. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you see it from the air, it starts to make a lot more sense. So we can see that central mound I was talking about here. These are the 8 trenches that we excavated over the course of the 3 years of excavation. Trench 8's just falling off the edge of the screen over there. And you'll see why Trench 8 is there in a little while, because there's no obvious reason there. So you can see the 4 banks and ditches. Most of the outer one is gone. You can see that missing section to the east, and particularly the southeast. There's a big hole over here on the west side, which is probably a quarry. This sinuate cut through the middle of the site, which I talked about a little while ago, but the central mound sitting there, or more or less central mound at least. And then this odd kind of gap down here at the south, where you've got the embankment that comes round, then stops, and you can just about make out here what looks like a cut. So there's an enclosure that runs around here, and you'll see that a little bit clearer in the next slide, which gives you a sense of the geophysical survey. So when we first started the geophysics, the first section of geophysics in the middle here was done with Chris Carey, University of Brighton, and then Susan Curran and various other people filled in bits to the east and to the north. There's more extensive survey than this. This only goes a certain distance. You'll see more of it later on. So you can see the 4 banks and ditches, or the 4 circuits, which are still there, despite the fact, if you go back to the previous slide, obviously the southeast, the banks are gone, but the ditches are still in pretty good condition there. And the first day of survey we started up at this corner, and the first thing we hit was these 3 parallel ditches. And we thought, what on earth is that? Because it wasn't the upstanding monument. So it became clear reasonably quickly that there was an earlier phase. Somebody's waiting in the waiting room, we'll let them in. There's an earlier phase that runs underneath the present monument. So what we've got are at least 3 overlapping phases. So you can see the southern enclosure, which I pointed out a second ago down here, which is a lot clearer in the geophysics. You've got this earlier phase, which runs beneath the current monument of Tlachtga, and then you've got the monument of Tlachtga itself. And then you've got whatever's going on over at the east here, which was unclear. It's unclear really how this relates to the present monument. There may be a gap in here. There's certainly what looks like potentially an entrance that's running up here. And there's another entrance feature that's running from the southeast down here. There's a roadway which may potentially go along with the earlier phase of enclosure. There's lots of stuff we still don't know about this site, despite 3 seasons of excavation. They're relatively small trenches. It's a very large monument. In fact, it's at least 2, possibly 3 very large monuments. Okay. Oh, that's just there. This is part of the Discovery Programme survey at the centre of the Hill of Tara with Anne-Forrad and Rathgronja, not Rathgronja, and Chuck Cormac. And again, this idea of potentially partially overlapping monuments is really interesting, and it's something we'll come back to as we go through. There's certainly a feeling that these happen at different times, and that one monument is built to overlap another monument, and I'm becoming less certain that that's necessarily the case here now. Okay, so just a close-up there. These are our trenches again. So just running through, and I'll run through these before each of the little bits I'm going to talk about. But in the first season, we really wanted to get dating material from the 3 different phases. So trench 1 was to take the outer bank ditch pair of Tlachtga. Trench 2 was the inner ditch of this earlier monument. Trench 3 was part of the southern enclosure, as we've come to call it. The second, and we also put a small test pit in the middle here, test pit 2. There are actually 3 test pits, but 1 and 3 didn't really do very much. But test pit 2 in the center of the upstanding mound will crop up again later on. The second year, 2015, we put 1 large trench, and you'll see this as we go. In fact, the next section will cover a lot of this across all 3 ditches of this earlier monument down here. As well as 1 smaller trench across where the southern enclosure and Tlachtga actually meet, to try and pick apart that relationship, because that relationship was still unclear. It's still not wonderfully clear, but it's becoming clearer, I think. And then in the last season, we actually took a small section out of the central mound. We excavated part of the innermost ditch of Tlachtga, and we also put a small trench into this eastern section to try and make some sense of what these eastern features are. So that's essentially what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time here now. Okay, there's a bit of a clue here. I'm calling this the hillfort phase. So this is our early phase, particularly focusing on trench 2 and trench 4. When we first started at trench 2, it took us about Meath was supervising this trench, and after several days we were just thinking, oh, is there actually anything here? Because we hadn't actually found the ditch yet, so we were clearing it away from both ends, and we were just like rock, 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 rock. And then by the time we got to this stage, it was very clear that there was a reasonably substantial ditch cut into the rock. This is quite a nice place to dig in some ways, because when we talk about natural here, natural is rock. There's not really much confusion as to whether we've hit natural or not. If you've hit bedrock, then you're on natural. So this is the ditch, trench 2, and you can see as we go through that, what you end up with is a really substantial rock cut ditch, a couple of meters across, and the rock is essentially just smashed and then leave it up. Now, where the rest of that rock has gone in terms of form of bank material, it's probably just gone back into the ditch when this ditch has been infilled. And we'll talk about dates for some of this stuff in a little while. But relatively straightforward in terms of stratigraphy, features. There's very little going on here except 1 very large rock cut ditch. So this was quite straightforward. I think Meath possibly found it a little bit frustrating that there wasn't slightly more going on here other than a lot of pickaxe work. Getting the rock out of these rock cut ditches is not easy. Trench 4 was a little bit more entertaining. So trench 4 is going across, as I said earlier, all 3 of the circuits of this earlier monument. You can see it over here. So that's outer, middle, inner, and there's a little feature at the southern end that you can see. This is the water treatment work. So this enclosure is coming around right over here, comes out the other side over here. So this is about where trench 2 was, over this way somewhere. Must be further round actually. And then into the next field across. So the outer ditch of it just comes into the next field and probably runs underneath the water treatment works. It's about 200 meters across. So the present monument would probably fit in the middle of it. It's a slightly weird monument. It's closely spaced multivallate. We tend to think of closely spaced multivallation as being a late Iron Age innovation. And you might even be able to see it in this image somewhere, the Hill of Lloyd, which, no, it will be over the other side. So Hill of Lloyd, which would be over to the right there. Discovery Program Geophysics showed that to have closely spaced multivallation. I suspect there's more closely spaced multiple vallation going on earlier than we think. So in this case, this turns out to be certainly earlier than late Iron Age. Running through this from the outside inwards, the outer ditch here, relatively narrow. You could step across this probably, V-shaped. You can see the tip line of the rock there. We've had a human mandible out of the bottom of this as well, which I'll talk about when I talk about the dating in a little while. So really the outer ditch is pretty narrow, working our way back in. The middle ditch, much broader, but also quite difficult to define in some ways. Essentially what's happened again, they lever off planes of this bedrock. When you crack it, you could probably stick something underneath it and just lever it off a block at a time. So that's what's been going on here, and they've created a ditch by doing that. So it's not really a flat bottom ditch or even a V-shaped ditch. It's almost just like a break in the rock. The inner ditch is much more substantial, and much more substantial even than we saw at Trench 2. So you can see a lot of people working away at it here, and various planning going on of some of the bedrock around it. And you can see when we go in, there's Erin Crowley, who's planning it at the time. You can see this is only recently cleared because that's still damp. So there's a large slump of material down here, which only came out more or less on the last day. Then it was planned and backfilled almost as soon as it actually came out. A mixed drum on the right over here. And you can see it's a pretty substantial ditch. This is just a very small section of it, but you can fit a lot of people in it anyway. Backfilled with just mostly broken bedrock. There are some recuts going on in some of these ditches. They're not anything to date in some of those recuts, unfortunately. So we got good dating material from the base of the ditches, but the recuts didn't have anything really that was datable in them. So we're not sure exactly when the recuts happened. On the inner edges of the ditch, underneath this kind of last skim of material, there's a whole series of these very small stake holes, essentially rock cut stake holes or very small post holes, which probably form some kind of anchor to a bank, which was there at some point. So there's quite a lot of these in various parts. We didn't see any of them over at Trench 2, but there's plenty of them at Trench 4. And these mirror some of the things that seem to be going on in some of the hill forts down in Wicklow that were excavated recently by James O'Driscoll and Billy O'Brien. So some quite similar kinds of things. Just outside the enclosure to the south, there's a possible drying kiln, corn drying kiln. Now, we don't have a flue for this particularly. You can see there's something at the top there, which I think is more likely to be a furrow than a flue. And it doesn't have an enormous number of grains in it, but it looks like it has in situ burning. It does have serial grains in it. So it's the right sort of shape for a kiln of this kind of date, which I'll tell you about in a second. So it's probably a drying kiln. Talking about dates, these top two dates we can ignore for the moment. So these are from elsewhere on site. But these three dates here correspond to the three ditches of that monument. So you can see they partially overlap. So certainly the first one, the top one is the inner ditch, middle ditch, outer ditch. The inner ditch and the middle ditch overlap. The middle ditch and the outer ditch overlap. The inner ditch and the outer ditch do not overlap. So what seems to be happening here is a sequential construction where you start with the inner ditch and then you build the middle one, then you build the outer one. Maybe happening at the same time, more or less, but at least there's no overlap between the inner one and the outer one, which is quite interesting. In terms of fill dates for these monuments, we got two dates out of the fill. Problem with the fill is essentially it's quite uniform in a lot of places. So you could date a whole lot of material out of there, but selection of material is quite difficult. There's almost no serial remains. There's quite a lot of animal bone. So there is material for dating, and there's a good bit of charcoal in some of these deposits. But it's just choosing the dating material is something of a lottery. So we could get more dates from these fills. And if we were to get more dates, that's probably where they would go. But the two that we have are fairly consistent, and they seem to be filling in somewhere kind of 400 BC or so. So what we've got is a monument that opens at about 1100, 1150 BC and closes at about 400 BC. And then the date at the bottom here, that's the kiln. That's the drying kiln outside the monument. That's potentially quite close. So there's quite a wide range on this date you see here on this second date and also on the kiln date. So you can see that at the narrowest, that's quite a narrow range, but at the widest, it's quite a wide range. And I'll return to that later. But it's certainly post-dates, the dates that we've got from the fill of the monument. So so far as we're concerned, this is the only thing that's going on at this site at this moment in time in the Iron Age. We don't have any clue really what else is going on. at that moment in time. This is all before the current monument was constructed. So this is an earlier phase of the monument that we didn't know about before we actually started working at the hill. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the southern enclosure and the Tlachtga ditches. So going back to this again, southern enclosure, the first season was trench 3 down here, and trench 1 was to take the outermost of the Tlachtga ditches, and then trench 5 hit both of those. It hit the Tlachtga ditches and it hit part of the southern enclosure, and then trench 7 down here was just the innermost of the Tlachtga ditches. So we've got several different bits of different ditches that are excavated through, to try and give us some idea of, again, whether there's sequential construction of the site, and how this southern enclosure in particular fits in with everything else. So the southern enclosure to begin with, this was excavated, this supervised by Cleaner, who you can see over there on the left, in 2014. Another rock cut ditch. So again, quite easy to spot. This post, excuse me, this post hole up here is one of the Bronze Age. In fact, it's down here because north is towards me as I'm sitting here. Is one of the earlier Bronze Age dates. So this post hole here just predates the construction of the ditches that we have on the site. So again, we were initially thinking maybe this is a prehistoric monument, rather than an early medieval monument. So we'll see that as we go through. The next few slides have human remains in them. As we reach the base of this ditch, really pretty much as we came on to bedrock, just before a bank holiday weekend, human remains started to become visible. And you can see just here, and a real testament actually to both Cleaner and Abby Ash, who were excavating on the site at the time, because this was an incredibly fragile and delicate excavation. The skeleton is the skeleton of a very young infant, 4 to 6 months old, placed on the bottom of the ditch in a formal setting. And you can see some of these stones started to become visible here. In the next slide, you'll see it much more clearly. So you can see here, this is mostly excavated. And you can see that the legs are still being excavated. This is Abby here excavating this out. And you can see this formal setting that's around the skeleton. There were some larger slabs over the top there. And that's the full excavation of the remains there. So that's all of the images of that I'm going to show. Lara Cassidy did some DNA work for us on that infant. Turns out the infant was a he, and a really quite an interesting he. So this will all be in the final publication. But the affinities are really not very Irish, let's say. So this is the DNA profile of our infant from the Hill of Hoard. This is Irish Iron Age stuff, Irish medieval stuff, and you can see just looking at the colour bars here, this has very little in common with Irish material. In fact, it's most closely related to Iron Age English material, and particularly English. So not, if you look at the colours where they signify on the map here, it's not, we're not talking about Scotland, we're not talking about Wales, we're particularly talking about England, and maybe southwest England. So there's an interesting question in there as to what this means. It's probably beyond me to actually answer that question at the moment, but it's certainly something we can think about. And I know that Katharina Becker is doing various bits on similar kind of burials at the moment. So maybe when she has more data, there'll be something we might be able to answer with this. The intersection between the two monuments, between the southern enclosure and the Tlachtga ditch, is interesting and quite confusing. So I've just spent quite a lot of today actually re-looking at some of this stuff, and what seems to happen if you follow this around. So this is the cut of the Tlachtga ditch here, this big rock cut ditch again. But then you can see over on the left here, there's a secondary cut. So actually it's a primary cut. So it actually sits beneath the cut of the Tlachtga ditch. So what's happening, if you look at the geophysics here, this is where our trench is. That's the Tlachtga ditch coming around here. That's this. this section over here on the left-hand side is the southern enclosure ditch there, which stops. So what seems to be the case is that these two things were constructed pretty much at the same time and actually respect one another. So it seems to actually be a unified structure rather than necessarily being built in two phases. So this idea that we were talking about earlier, where you have one phase overlapping another phase, maybe isn't what's going on here. Maybe what's going on here is actually that you've got two things that are built at the same time. And you'll see when I get to the dating that that might make some sense. Within the Tlachtga ditch, on the right-hand side, we have a metalworking area, this little hearth. There's interesting charcoal results because the charcoal is very mixed, and it's not necessarily something we might expect from Lorna O'Donnell did the charcoal for me, not something we might necessarily expect from a metalworking area, but there were 3 crucible fragments from in here that Brendan O'Neill looked at with copper alloy and silver residues on them. So there's precious metalworking going on within the ditch of the monument. Going over to Trench 1, this is the bank at Trench 1, relatively denuded at this stage, but you can see as we go in, one interesting thing was this little stone that we found on top, and you can see it's very out of place really. Most of this is blocky bits of limestone that are just essentially quarried bedrock, and this little bit of sandstone is sitting there in a different context, and what that turns out to be is this, which is a small piece of probable megalithic art, part of probably a large circular motif. We're very much within sight of Loch Crew from here, and Slieve Gullion and Tara. So we are in passage tomb country, but there's no evidence of there having been a passage tomb here. But this small piece of stone is almost certainly part of a passage tomb. Trench 7. This is from the 2016 season, and you can see this is one of those areas where the bank has been denuded, but this massive load of stone you can see here is the ditch fill, and it slightly worrying when one sees this because there's a big ditch underneath that, and the weather in 2016 was particularly unpleasant. So we have a series of photos that look like this of people working through what looks like serious mud. Sieving became extremely difficult. This is Meath McCormick. Actually, Meath was over at Trench 8 rather than Trench 7, but it's just a particularly wet-looking photograph. But actually, after a month of digging, we ended up with this, which actually is a fairly stunning ditch section. So this is the innermost ditch, again, probably the most substantial ditch of the main monument of Tlachtga, and very nice section there. Again, there's various little recuts and burned horizons in this. You can see again tip lines here, and I'll talk about dates again in a second. So again, everything is rock cut essentially. A few nice finds from in here. So we have this, which is a basalt ingot mold. It has actually, as well as on this face, you can see there are 3 molds on this face. It has at least one more on the back, probably one on the top of it, and maybe one on the side of it as well. So it's kind of a Swiss Army knife type affair. You can use it for all sorts of different casting. Varna Orfanu, who was a postdoc here a couple of years ago, did some portable XRF work on this for me. And this turns out to have been used for casting copper alloy again, so possibly brass. We have a little ring pin. So you can see here, copper alloy pin again. Rena Maguire had a little look at this and suggested it's more similar to the early medieval ones rather than to the later kind of things that we might see. So it's possibly again part of this early medieval phase. Again, I'll talk about the dates in a second. And we also had this, which is not breakfast cereal. It's actually the one piece of gold that we had from the site. It's a small gilded hair ornament, which Katharina Becker and also Rena suggest maybe a late Bronze Age affair. So part of the earlier phase, but redeposited within this kind of later phase of monument that we're talking about here. So in terms of the dates of this phase, in fact, we're talking about 2 phases here. We're talking about a construction phase and we're talking about a use phase. So what we've got going on here, this date at the top, let's just park for a moment. But these other dates are reasonably consistent, and they are related not only to Tlachtga, but also to the southern enclosure. So we have 3 dates from Tlachtga and 1 from the southern enclosure, all of which are almost identical. One of those is direct dating on human remains, one of them is dating on cattle bone, one of them is dating on a fox tooth from the from the ditch of the second outer Tlachtga ditch. And one is the base of Trench 7. So essentially, these are very consistent construction dates for 2 different phases of monument. And I see no way that they can be anything else. So, and this one, as I say, we'll talk about as we go through. We'll talk about that in a little while. We have a second phase of activity, and some of this I'll talk about again in a little while. But the hearth, some of the other activity in Trench 5, some of the activity in Trench 8, which I'll talk about in a little while, all comes in at this other phase, probably running from the 8th century through to the very early 11th century or late 10th century. So what's going on is we seem to have this early phase of construction, late phase of, if you like, kind of floret, like it's an increase in use, it's a change in use, and what's going on in between, we really don't necessarily know. So there's a gap in between here where we have no dates, which is quite interesting. It's like the thing is built and then left alone for potentially up to a couple of 100 years. Let's talk a little bit about the central platform. So again, Trench 6 and Test Pit 2 really are the 2 places where we targeted the central platform. We didn't really get a chance to go back to Test Pit 2. It would have been nice to do more there, and you'll see it as we go through. You can see where that was based. We put that there because there was a massive magnetic splodge there, and there's good reason for that, which we'll see again in a little while. Trench 6, though, taking out a small part of that central mound, as we went down through that, you can see, first of all, we hit a surface which is made of these rounded cobbles. And this is kind of a prepared surface in some way, probably an activity surface. And then a revetment. So the first of 2 revetments, in fact. This is a blocky revetment. So you can see some of these blocks are quite substantial. And also full of this dump of shale, of really smashed up shale. We thought this would never end when we were digging through this. Claire Ryan spent about a week digging through this stuff here, and it was just, it was awful. There was nothing in it. It was just broken shale. So first revetment, surface on the top there. There's a better view of the first revetment cleaned up and the surface there. On top of this surface, there are a few really nice finds. So we have this very nice ground stone axe, which the far end of which is pecked for hafting. So I think Justin found that very early on. So Justin Moffat, and then we had a nice petit tranché derivative projectile point. So again, Neolithic stuff. This was Erin found this one, and I can't remember. I think Noel might have found this one. Noel Carroll may have found this one. A really nice little barb tanged projectile point again. So we've got Neolithic, Bronze Age. So we've got a few bits of prehistoric stuff essentially gathered together and stuck up on top of the mound. And I think when we first started here, we were quite optimistic. One of the things we were thinking before we began, I suppose, was that this central mound might be a prehistoric feature that had been enclosed. And the fact that we came across these nice prehistoric objects right at the beginning of our excavation on Trench 6 made us think, oh yeah, maybe we're right. And then we didn't really find anything else for the next 2 weeks, probably. And there's good reason for that. So we'll talk about that as we go through. As we went through, this is still, this is a second revetment you can see now. This is a slabby revetment. So you can see this is much more thin slabs of limestone or shale even, rather than the first one, which was the big blocks of limestone. You can still see the surface at the top there, these rounded stones. You can see them in profile there as well. And we started hitting this very dark reddened material that initially we thought may have been burned, but quickly became apparent that it wasn't burned. There's no charcoal in it. There was no anything in it really. And what it appears to be is just a very, very degraded organic matter of some sort. So Helen Lewis, who is doing the thin section work for me at the moment, thinks perhaps it might be wood, or whatever else it is. It's just entirely organic material that's completely decomposed. There's nothing in it. When we sieved it, almost entirely went through the sieve. There were no fines, there were no ecofacts, so there was nothing in it. It just disappears. When you take that out, we come down onto this kind of grayer material. So you can see that orange layer over the top there. It's like a layer cake in the middle there, and this grayer material underneath. So this, which is full of cultural materials, full of animal bone. For some charcoal, no seeds in it at all, but there's quite a lot of material in there again. That's just a nicer view of it there. This is at context 818, this stuff here, and there's a little burned area within it, which is 822. There's that reddened material again above the top there, and there's Mick Drum, who's just troweling away at it. Underneath this, and I saw Aidan Giblin just came into the thing a moment ago. This is something Aidan found. We have this nice bifacially worked planar convex knife, which again is probably Bronze Age. So what you've got is on top of the thing, you've got Neolithic and Bronze Age material. On the bottom of the thing, you've got Bronze Age material. And then we've got the radiocarbon dates. And the first clue that the radiocarbon dates could be interesting was underneath some of this red material. First of all, we found at least one iron object, and we found a horse tooth there as well. So that's making me think, well, maybe this isn't quite as early as all that. And these were our dates. So 822 is that first date that we could see there on the construction phase. This is AD 261 to 529, overlaps with those other construction dates, but maybe slightly earlier. But 818, which is this kind of big layer of cultural material underneath it, and it's entirely secure, there's no way that date's intrusive, is AD 776 to 1036. So it fits with a later phase of activity. It doesn't fit with the construction phase. The mound was not the first thing to be put up on the site. It was one of the last things to be put up on the site. Okay. Going up to the top of the monument, test bit 2, we hit the kind of the last thing to go up, really, I suppose. And this is the reason why we were getting those massive magnetic signatures up on top of the mound. What we've got is a pit which is full of kind of a lot of refuse and stuff of one sort or another, but also massively burned material. So you can see all this in situ burning here. That black line you can see here is actually a burned timber. So it's an in situ burned timber. And there's also really substantial bits of vitrified clay in there, which are probably coming from some kind of industrial process. All of the wood in here is oak, which again maybe points towards either construction or industry. And that's when this dates to. So this again is later than everything else. So what's going on is the mound is built, and then at a certain point, a little later on, something else is built on top of the mound. A wooden building, possibly with some kind of fairly serious industrial activity going on. Bear in mind that this is a date on oak, so there could be some kind of old wood effect going on here, and these dates may well overlap if you bring that one back a bit. The Eastern Complex. Now, this was supposed to be the easy trench. This is a bit of a laugh, really, because we didn't really know what it was. It was a small exploratory trench. It was an 8 by 3 meter trench we started off as, and it turned out to be extremely complicated. So this is kind of a post-ex view of some of it, and what we can see, I should have put the ditch back, the geophysics image back in to show you what we were supposed to be excavating. We're supposed to have 2 ditches. You can kind of see them here. This is one ditch, and this is the northern ditch of the 2, which runs straight east-west. This is the southern ditch, and you can see the far side of it here, and it's running in a diagonal kind of line across the bottom end of the trench. Lots and lots of other features cut within this. So not only do we have lots of features, the weather was shocking. I saw Tressa was here earlier. Here she is. in a very wet trench 8, trying desperately to clean things back, and before for another photograph, the number of times it was cleaned back for photographs and then it rained on it again, it was not much fun. But in the end, what we ended up with was a very complicated small trench of archaeology. So you can see here, it's not raining for a change here. This is one of the plans. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, except to say there's a lot of contexts in it. And I'm not going to talk about the matrix in any great detail, except just to stick it in and show that Meath spent a lot of time working this out. And again, it's quite complicated. So for a very small trench, there's a lot of archaeology in it. Some nice finds. So we have this coronet ring. So this is part of an antler coronet ring, very early medieval. There's a few of them from around Ireland. So we've got a nice report done on some of these bone finds. A nice bone needle that Erin found, actually, again, it's in 2 pieces. It's now back in 2 pieces. You can see it's joined in the middle there. But pig fibula needle, so that cropped up in some of the post-ex work. And the other thing that we found was some coins. So we found a number of these things. You can see here, this is Jan, who's just cleaning one up at the moment. And we found one, and then we found more, and we found more, and we found more. And we ended up with quite a lot of these. So we ended up with 22 Anglo-Saxon silver coins in the end, of which, well, one of them was in 2 pieces. So 23 pieces of 22 coins. And these date from Athelstan, and I'll talk about this in a minute, so I'm not going to go into it in any great detail now, from Athelstan to Edgar, and I'll give you the dates of those in a little while, but essentially from their mid-10th century. Looking at that in terms of our dating, we've got 2 radiocarbon dates from down at the bottom of the trench here, which range from 775 to 976 or 977. The 2 dates are almost identical again, which is nice. So most of our dates is one that misbehaves, but all of the rest of our dates are behaved extremely well. And the hoard of coins, which sits above those, or only just above those, which is from 924 to 973. And 973 is when Edgar reformed the English coinage. So, as I said, 22 coins. We have all of the kings ranging from Athelstan, Edmund, Edwig, and mostly Edgar, but none post the coinage reform of 973. We have an Eric Blood Axe coin, which is probably 954 in York, but 2 of the Edgar coins are die-linked, so they're likely made not long before deposition. They've only recently been struck, probably. There's one contemporary forgery, but exactly what they're doing there is not clear. It's an interesting, excuse me, it's an interesting area. We have evidence elsewhere on site for precious metal working, and there's other stuff going on here, which I'll talk about just briefly in a moment. But there's definitely metal working going on here as well. So it's possible that these are being reworked in some way. Now, Andrew Woods, who's looked at the coins, makes the point that if you're melting down silver, there isn't a lot of silver in these, but it could be part of what's going on at least. Okay, so I'll come to some synthesis now, because we're nearly at the hour. So we start off with a big Bronze Age enclosure. Now, there's stuff going on the site probably before that. We've got various bits of find. We've got 2 pieces of Middle Neolithic pottery. We've got the bit of megalithic art. We've got various bits of Neolithic stuff. We've got two stone axes. So there is at least some Neolithic activity on top of the hill there. What form that took, we haven't really found, but if there was a Neolithic site underneath all of this other stuff, it's been twice displaced at this stage, so the chance of there actually being anything left there is pretty slim. It was built maybe over quite a long period of time. So the minimum span for construction is about 120 years. If you take the shortest date between the end of one phase and the end of and the start of the next, so you're talking about 120 years minimum, up to maybe a few hundred years. Exactly how long that took, we'll probably never know, but it's not a small undertaking by any means. How many people did that? No clue. It's the sort of question people ask, what was the population, how many people? I really couldn't tell you. This seemed to be an active use. What that use was, I can't again tell you, until about 350 BC. There's plenty of animal bone in there. There's people coming up and consuming Meath. There's almost no cereal remains there, so literally maybe a dozen cereal grains in the bits that we excavated. So whatever they're doing there seems to revolve particularly around animals, and probably cattle in particular. Very few wild animals at all. Exactly what that is, we're not sure. There's more stuff that we can potentially do with the animal bone at a later date. There seems to be a gap then until the drying kiln. Now, it could have been a very short gap, so it could have only been 30 years. The minimum gap is about 30 years. But because of the way the dates are and the kind of plateau that you've got around then, there could potentially have been a much longer gap, up to 450 years. And all we've got that's in that phase is this single probable drying kiln. There's nothing else going on there at that time. We don't have any other dates. And then what seems to happen is we just don't know until the next date that we've got is 822, which is that burn phase underneath the central mound, which the earliest date for that is 261 AD, but the latest date could be a couple hundred years after that. So that seems to be the first hints of a medieval thing, or late Iron Age through into an early medieval phase that's going on. You then have construction of both the southern enclosure and Tlachtga at more or less the same time. Now, exactly what's going on there is unclear, but it seems like the functions of the monuments are quite different. So the southern enclosure definitely seems to have some ritual aspect. And I know we talk about ritual all the time as archaeologists, but it does have this peculiar infant burial, which is definitely not in any kind of Christian fashion. It's an unusual individual, so not a native Irish person potentially, or at least somebody with British ancestry. It's one of a number of these late Iron Age stroke early medieval infant burials. And there's a clear association with some of the animal bone as well. So when we were excavating it, it was very clear that these large elements of animal bone were placed around the base of the ditch on the rock in the same way as the human burial was. So exactly what's going on there is not clear, but it does kind of feel like, because of the fact that the dates all seem to hit the same time, it feels like this is part of a single project rather than necessarily being two things that happen to be overlapping one another. So it isn't necessarily a case of which came first. Much more, they seem to be built at the same time. After that, we've got this small gap. We've got no dates between 555 AD, which is the latest date for the infant burial, and 659 AD, which is the kind of the earliest date for the second phase of activity, if you like, for this later early medieval phase. And it's probably even later than that. So all of the other dates for that second phase, the earliest dates for those are probably 8th century, which is the stuff we just saw from the Eastern complex. So you might have 200 or 300 years where we really don't have a clue what's going on. You've got this massive upstanding monument, but no obvious activity going on there. And then beyond the 8th century, things really pick up and intensify. So what we've got then is we've got much more activity going on. We've got more animal bone. We've got much more in terms of plant macrofossil remains. So there's lots and lots of seeds of one sort or another. So David Stone, Nicola Gilligan have written me an excellent report on that. The mound is constructed at some point, probably in the 10th century, maybe a little earlier. And it kind of seems to function almost like a motte. It's this weird idea of it's mounding the site. So rather than starting with a mound that's enclosed, we have an enclosure that's mounded, which I think is quite interesting. The Eastern complex is constructed at some point in this process, and it seems to be a metalworking centre. So we definitely have evidence of metalworking going on there. We have hammer scale, for example, in there, and various other bits and pieces. So there's definite metalworking going on in the Eastern complex. And then whatever goes on top there, we've got this later timber construction and industrial activity, which may be Anglo-Norman or may not. In terms of thinking about this as an Anglo-Norman centre, there is a lot of Anglo-Norman activity within the immediate landscape. So we have two deserted Anglo-Norman villages very close by, one of which I found in the LiDAR work back in 2012 at Wardstown, the other of which at Rathmore is well known. It has the Rathmore Church, and Siobhan Reinisch published an article in Archaeology Ireland about this years ago. And then the geophysics shows a whole lot more stuff over here, which including what looks like both an early medieval and a moated site stuck in this field off to the east here. Now, a lot of this stuff has been under plough for quite a while now since we were excavating it. So what state these are in now, I don't know, because they were being planted up for potatoes. But there is clearly a lot of Anglo-Norman activity going on in this area. An interesting parallel might be the site of Kilfinnan. So Kilfinnan down in County Limerick, my colleague Tlachtga O'Keefe wrote about this years ago, and Kilfinnan's described as a motte. And he talked about this idea of this great mound that was imported shovelful by shovelful into tight interior and existing triple ramparted ring. So at least at one point in time, that seems to be what's gone on at the Hill of Ward as well. So this central mound is not the earliest feature on the site by a long way. In fact, what you've got is something which started out much more as a conventional rath, but a large conventional rath. And then in the middle of it, at some point, there's been a central mound constructed. So that's pretty much where we're up to with this at the moment. There is more stuff I could talk about, but I have gone on for an hour now. And I suppose all that remains of me to thank the enormous number of people that have contributed over the years, many of whom are actually in here. So you can see some of these people are supervisors over the years, specialists in particular. I noticed Ruth was in here, but also, for example, David, who did macrofossils, Mark Powers, who did some of the lithics back in the day. Brendan O'Neill has looked at the burn materials. There's just a lot of people that have, I could run through them, Lara Cassidy, people that worked on the post-ex, in particular Catherine McCormick, Rebecca Sway and Katrina Baldwin. Again, huge amount of work that went in from a lot of people. And a lot of people helped with securing funding for this, in particular Meath County Council, thanks particularly to John and David Gilroy. Meath County Council were instrumental in this project. So between Meath County Council and the Royal Irish Academy, this wouldn't have happened without their input. So keep an eye out for the publication when it's finally finished. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Steve, thank you so much for that. That was a really comprehensive overview of a very complicated site, and I don't know how you keep some of that straight. But we do have, I know we've just said we're just an hour in, but we do have time for a couple of questions.
Where was the antler found in relation to the infant burial?
I can't tell you exactly spatially, but along the bottom of the ditch. There's more antler found in that particular phase in the southern enclosure than there probably was anywhere else. I suspect it's about construction.
Okay, so
probably one of your main construction tools there would have been antler. You need something that's really substantial to be able to lever up those planes of bedrock, and I strongly suspect they were using antler just to do that job.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Thanks, Rasa. We have a couple of questions in the chat. So the first one from Caroline McGrath there. Forgive my memory, were there dates from the human remains, which I think you said they were late Iron Age, early medieval? Any indication they might have been slaves, prisoners of war from England?
No. I mean, all we have. Well, there are actually the remains of 3 individuals from the Hill of Ward, but the one's essentially a tooth, just one tooth, of a young adult. One is a mandible of a mature male, and that one is in the outer ditch of the hillfort enclosure, and that's one of the dates of the infill of that enclosure. So that's a late Iron Age individual, or an Iron Age individual, and we couldn't get any DNA out of that. There was none in it, although Lara is having another go with another tooth. But the infant was just too. There was no indication as to what caused the infant's demise, let's say. I think there's probably an awful lot of things that could have happened that would have ended up in its death without leaving any physical trace. I see Betty O'Brien's in here. She might have some comments on this one as well.
A couple more questions there. Ross, I see you've got your hand there if you want to ask something.
Yeah, hi Steve, that was great, thanks. I
All
just wondering about the central mound, and you mentioned Tighe's theory about the Kilfennan in Limerick.
Yeah, yeah.
Was there anything about the material that the central mound was made of that might suggest where it was from, or is there anything missing from somewhere else, like a large quarry pit visible in the in the lidar or anything?
There is a big quarry south of the road, but I think we'd always assumed it was a lake quarry. The material is slightly odd in that the shale, for example, is not the bedrock that we're seeing up there. So the shale has been brought in from somewhere. It's hard to know for what purpose, because it doesn't sit comfortably. You know, it slides. It acts like scree, so it doesn't form a nice solid mound. So why they were particularly seeking out this shale is unclear. I suspect it went up pretty quick. So one of the things I suppose I didn't say, we found those things on top of the site, and then we found almost nothing else. In fact, pretty much, I don't think there was anything else that we found until we got to the planar convex knife underneath it. So we went through 1.5 meters of mound material with nothing in it at all. So I strongly suspect this is all, it's gone up in 1, 2, 3. You know, they've put it up in one go, pretty much. But yeah, there is definitely, they're seeking out particular material. The shale in particular, they are looking for a particular purpose. And exactly where that's coming from, I don't know. I think it's coming far, but it's not local.
That's great, Steve. We just have a couple more questions in the chat, if that's okay. So Des asked, or Des says, it's a fascinating site, and the theory is that it's a ritual site. Can I ask, where is the water source? There is so many sites in the immediate area. The whole countryside is packed full of sites.
The water is an interesting one in that there is a well, and it's a particularly, now my recollection of this is not great, but the waters from the well of Tlachtga are one of the kind of privileges of the King of Tara. So it would have been, it's a particularly important well in that sense. So again, this is going back to some of the medieval literature. The Ward River is not 1,000,000 miles away as well, but so we're not very far from a water source, but there's nothing actually up on top of the hill that I'm aware of.
That's great. And then $1 million question here, Steve, from Rory. Will there be a publication of the site? If so, where might it be available?
We hope so. So we are in the process of trying to finish off a monograph on this for Oxbow Books. We have about 200 odd pages at the moment, so we have most of it done. There's still a few little bits outstanding, as well as quite a lot of editing outstanding, but we are working towards a fairly tight deadline to try and get this submitted out. So yeah, in more than in theory, there will be a monograph on this. It's just, you know, probably watch this space, but it's on the way.